when we try to wrestle with the ineffability of the transcendence of God, it's really, really difficult for us to put it in any kind of human words, because we have to explain both light and dark. So I've taken 3 readings from the scriptures, one from the book of Genesis, one from Isaiah, one from John's Gospel, that show this kind of this dance between light and dark within God itself. From Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. From Isaiah, "I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and I create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things." And from John's Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him was made nothing that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." These are words inspired by God. So for any newcomers among us, it's my custom to take a theme for a month, and then on the first Sunday of the month and the second Sunday, I develop the theme. On the third Sunday, I do a recap of the 2 of them and then open it up to a Q&A. So the theme I've been wrestling with for this month is a series of questions that I want to ask God and ask of myself. And the first question, so it'll be the theme for the month, is life a dream or a simulation? And is God a dream or a simulation? So that's what I'll be wrestling with for this month, God willing. So let me start with a story. I've been recording my dreams since 1979. And years and years and years ago, here in Healdsburg, I've lived in Healdsburg for 30 years now, in the middle of the forest. And I went to bed at night and had a dream. And in the dream, I was back in Cork in Ireland in my mother's house, visiting with her. And so it got to be nighttime, and I decided to go to bed. And I go to bed in Cork, and I fall asleep and have a dream. And in this dream, I think I'm back in Kenya, where I worked as a missionary for 14 years. So I'm back in Kenya, and that seems to be totally real. And then I wake up and I realize I'm not in Kenya, I'm in my mother's house in Cork. And then there's a second awakening. I realize I'm not in my mother's house in Cork, I'm in Healdsburg, in my home. So there's a name for that in psychology. It's called false awakening. When you're so deep into a dream that there are levels of dreaming, and that you come out of one level of dream and you think you're awake, only to realize, no, I'm in another level of the dream. So that's where I want to go with this series of homilies then. Is life itself a dream, or is it a simulation? And is God a dream or a simulation? So what do false awakenings mean? For me, when I think of a false awakening, it's it's like a movement through the various bodies. Hinduism talks about 7 levels of the body. There's the physical body, there's the etheric body, there's the astral body, there's the mental body, there's the psychic body, there's the soul body, and then there's source itself. So for me, in some senses, false awakenings are where I move through these different levels of bodies, or I move through totally different dimensions. So each awakening is an invitation to go into a higher dimension of reality, or into a higher level of the self. So in that space, then, I ask myself the kinds of questions: who is God? I'm going to be asking a whole bunch of questions in this homily of myself and of you to think about. So when I think about how do we try to wrestle with the transcendence of God? And in many traditions, they speak about a trinity of persons. So within Hinduism, for instance, there's the notion of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Or sometimes a different version is Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, knowing, and bliss. So when you think of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, Brahma is the creator aspect of the divine. Vishnu is the sustainer of reality, and Shiva is the destructive force. But not destructive in the sense that it just lays waste to everything, but rather that it can discombobulates. It takes the pieces of the puzzle apart and recombines them to create a much more complex reality. And there was a very famous Russian-Belgian scientist who got the Nobel Prize in biochemistry sometime in the 1970s for something he called dissipative structures, where he solved an ancient problem in science. And the problem is this, that according to the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, all closed systems left to their own devices run themselves down into chaos. So you put a cup of coffee on the table and go away and come back in half an hour, it's at room temperature. Or you put your bicycle outside in the rain for the winter and you come back and it's all rusted. So all closed systems left to their own devices run themselves down into chaos. That's the second law of thermodynamics. At the same time, we realize that evolution shows that life is becoming more and more complex. So how can they both be true? How can there be entropy when there's more complexity developing? So this is the job of Shiva. Shiva is the one who disassembles existing configurations and recombines them into a different configuration and creating this jump in complexity. It's not that it's taking anything away or adding anything, it's just recombining the pieces. It's almost as if you had a jigsaw puzzle and you're assembling it, and then at some stage you have 40 pieces left over, and no matter where you try to put them in the holes left in the jigsaw, they won't fit. And then you realize, oh my God, I have assembled it wrongly. There are some parts I forced together because the contours seem to match, but the picture is not emerging. So you have to take the pieces away, some of the pieces away, and then there'll be a space for all the leftover pieces, and there'll be no holes left in the jigsaw. So that's the notion of Shiva energy within Hinduism. In Buddhism, you have the notion of Trinity, with this beautiful saying, Buddham saranam gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha. Dharmam saranam gacchami. I take refuge in the teaching. Sangam saranam gacchami. I take refuge in the community. So that's the Buddhist version of Trinity. And then you have the Christian version, Father, Son, and Spirit. And my definition is that the Father represents the isness of Source, and the Son represents the total self-knowledge that God has of herself, and the Spirit represents the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be. So you get the Trinitarian formula in many places. Now, for the last few months, I've actually been wrestling with a different notion rather than a Trinity. I think of God as a quaternity. The quaternity is a template which is, symmetrical about all axes. And so what I'm trying to do for myself is just wrestle with different templates in order to understand, some kind of a connection to Source. So when I think of the quaternity, it's like a great X in the sky. And so on the top left-hand side is the transcendence, the male aspect of the transcendence of God. At the top right is the female aspect of the transcendence of God. At the bottom right is the kind of the male aspect of the incarnated God, and at the bottom left is the female aspect of the incarnated God. And so you have at the top you have transcendence as Father and transcendence as Sophia. And then at the bottom you have immanence as Christus and immanence as Christa. So you've got a Christ consciousness and a Christa consciousness, which is the female aspect of the immanence of God. So just the idea is to try to wrestle what is basically ineffable. Because when we use human language to try to speak about God, we're hopelessly lost. So when the early church fathers talked about the three persons in God, the Christian version of God, they're using a Greek phrase which is called prosopon. And prosopon was the mask that an actor wore when he came on stage in order to clue the audience in as to what kind of a character he was going to portray. So if I came on stage with a mask that looked like this, it's going to be a comedy. If I came on stage with a mask that looked like this, it's going to be a tragedy. So the word they used in Greek was prosopon, which means a mask. So when it got translated into Latin, it got translated as persona. And when you think about it, that's the same notion. Per means through, and sona is sonar or sound. So is the mask with the hole in it through which you made sounds. So when they talked about the three personae of God, they weren't talking about three ontologically separate entities. They were talking about the masks that God wears are the ways in which we can kind of experience the divine. But unfortunately, the word person then became a personality. We think of personality as a kind of individual, ontologically separate individual. And there's always this great debate in psychology whether the personality is the result of nature or of nurture. Are you born the way you are and you'll never change? Or you're born as a blank slate and nurtured and the family will create of you what they want? I think there are three dimensions to the personality. There's nature, definitely. There's nurture, definitely. But by far more important is the soul that's coming in. The chief architect of the personality that evolves is not nature and it is not nurture. It is the soul coming in to a new environment. So I define personality then as the interface between essence and environment. The interface between the soul and the circumstances of incarnation. And the circumstances mean, what is the mission I came in to do? What are the 7 levels of body I bring with me? What is the family into which I'm parachuting? What is the culture of which I'm becoming a part? What is the era I've signed up for? So these are the circumstances that allow the soul to manifest itself with a particular kind of personality. So in wrestling with God, and these are some of the things that we need to think about. During this week then, I began to think about, I asked myself, does God dream? And when I'm talking about God for the rest of the homily, I'm talking about God's immanence, because I can say nothing about her transcendence. There are no words capable of articulating the transcendence of the divine. So when I speak about God, I'm talking about God as she reveals herself through her creation. Now, Carl Jung said very famously that the normal way in which the unconscious speaks to us is in our dreams, and we are meant to pay attention to our dreams. It's like a GPS system, a guidance system from the unconscious, helping us to live consciously in life. And then it speaks to us in synchronicities. This is the dialogue between, to use a Hindu terminology, between Atman and Jiva, between the disincarnate element of the soul and the incarnated element of the soul. Synchronicities occur. Jung says if we don't listen to our dreams and we don't take note of the synchronicities, then the next way the unconscious gets our attention is through psychosomatic illnesses. If you won't listen to the other two ways, you're going to get psychosomatic illnesses because you're off kilter. And finally, even if you won't listen even to the psychosomatic illnesses, there'll be an accident that will force you to stop what you're doing. So I've been asking myself the question then this week, does God dream? And is the cosmos actually a dream that God is having? Many, many years ago, I was on a book tour in Germany, and in answer to a question, I found myself saying the following thing. I said, life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. So yes, I would answer the question, God dreams. Now, is God then just entertaining himself as a defense against the loneliness of being the only one? Why would God dream? And I believe that if there is only God, then no relationship is possible. And if there's no relationship possible, no experiences can be generated. So in some senses, I ask myself the question, is God just entertaining himself as a defense against the loneliness of being the only one? I want to look at nightmares then in particular. There's a great culture in Malaysia called the Senoi people. And they're a dream sharing group. Every morning when they come down to breakfast, they share their dreams. And they teach the children how to work with their dreams. They teach the kids how to dream lucidly. In other words, to become aware during the dream that you are dreaming. And particularly if the kids report monsters in their dream or a nightmare, the parents tell them, go back into the dream, stop running, put your hand out and ask the monster, what gift are you trying to give me? Because every nightmare in some senses is just us running from our unconscious gifts. So to be able to stop, put my hand out and say, what gift are you offering me? And so I ask myself the question then, does God have nightmares? If God dreams, does God have nightmares? And are we the monsters in God's nightmares? Are we the dimensions or the characters in God's nightmare? Are we the way in which God faces the demons and asks gifts of it? Our nightmares then how God wrestles with her own shadow material. And are Lucifer, the light, and Ahriman, the darkness, are they elements of God's shadow work? Is that how God does, his shadow work? So is a nightmare for God then a struggle between the light and the dark? And is love both the origin of everything and the way to resolve the nightmare? So I've been asking all these questions this week for myself. So the next question I asked was, does God have lucid dreams? So a lucid dream is where you're dreaming and you realize that you're dreaming, and therefore you can take charge of the dream and have it go wherever you want. So then I ask the question, is creation how God turns lucid dreams into a cosmos? Is God having a lucid dream? And is God using this lucid dream to actually create a brand new cosmos? I ask myself, does God have false awakenings? When God is dreaming, is God having false awakenings? So is each dimension a false awakening that God is having? And so in the dimension, the dense dimension of 3Ds, is that one level, one dimension of God? And when God wakes up from that level, does he move into the etheric plane? And he wakes from that level and wakes to the astral plane and wakes from that and arrives at the mental plane and then the psychic plane and then the soul plane and then back to source herself. So are these the ways in which God, through false awakenings, moves through the evolutionary process, as God's immanence? So with all that now behind me, I began thinking about how then did we get here? We human beings, or us as creation. And you've heard me speak about this several times before. I call it the 5 L's. I believe ultimately there is only love. And love gives birth to twins. It gives birth to light, and it gives birth to logos. And light is matter. All we know from quantum mechanics, all matter is frozen light. And logos is the morphogenetic agent that creates shapes out of matter. It's like the potter that takes clay and turns clay into a bowl or a plate. And so logos is the morphogenetic agent. And together, light and logos dance, and they create life. They animate. They bring it alive. It's not just a whole bunch of still photographs. It's an animated thing. And that leads to laughter. And laughter is the journey back to love. And I've said to you before that you can be religious and not have a sense of humor. But you can't be spiritual and not have a sense of humor. Because a sense of humor is the spontaneous reaction to the realization that we're living in an illusion. And when you wake up from the illusion, your instinct is to laugh at the fact that you're taken advantage of. So then there's the journey back. Is God using love to create light? And is God using light to create matter? And is God using logos to create form? And is God using life to create stories? And is God using laughter to dissolve his own nightmare? Is that the function of laughter? A few years ago, I was very, very sick, and I was having a really, really high fever. And when I have a high fever, I get these really interesting visionary experiences. And so here was a visionary experience I had about 3 years ago. In this vision, first I see that there is only God. And therefore there are no relationships possible because there's nothing except she. And so no experiences can be generated. And so there's this extraordinary kind of a loneliness, a kind of a divine loneliness. And so God self-fractures into holographic fractals of self. And a holograph is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. And so God self-fractures into what Hebrew kind of mythology would call netzotzot, sparks of the divine. And then the next thing I saw in my vision was that God called all of these souls together and they decided to do a joint project. What are we going to do, to entertain ourselves? And so they decided we co-created a cosmos, the extraordinary cosmos, and we enjoyed being observers of it. What Buddhism will call turiya, the ability to witness from afar. And then God called us together for a second meeting and said, can we do something even more dramatic? Can we create avatars in multiple dimensions so that we become participant observers, in the creation? We're not just observing the cosmos from a distance and being so happy that we created this, but rather, can we participate in it? Can we become players within this drama? It's what cultural anthropology will call participant observer, and what Buddhism will call turiyatita, the ability to both participate in, but not identify with, to be a witness of incarnation. And so we invented this game of hide and go seek to see how far from source with a limited memory could we venture and still find our way homes. That's the whole point of incarnation. That's the whole point of the cosmos. That's the whole point of the dimensions of the spin-offs from source itself. To play this game of hide and go seek to see how far from source, with such limited memories and such a tiny little laptop between our ears, can we venture and still find our way back home. Now, we built in, I believe, a safety harness into this process, and that safety harness is the bifurcation of what Hinduism will call Atman and Jiva. Atman is that portion of soul that never leaves the side of God, and Jiva is the portion of the soul that participates in incarnation. And so we have the pre-incarnate and the incarnate versions of the soul in dialogue, and that's the safety harness to make sure we don't get totally lost forever. Some years ago, I did a drawing, and I just came across it a few days ago. I was cleaning out some shelves, and it was a diagram I had drawn. And in this diagram, I wish I were able to produce it for you. There's the sun shining, and it's shining in this huge, huge, big room. And there's a tiny hole in one wall, and the sun's rays are shining through it. And I began to realize that the sun represents God, and the sunshine represents love. And then there's this big building, and there's a wall, and the wall represents the boundary between God's transcendence and God's immanence. And the hole in the wall, the portal, is the spirit. And as this sunshine flows through this portal, it splits into a myriad of rays, and these are individual souls. And in my dream, I saw that each soul encounters a prism, and the prism diffracts the light into several colors. And the prism I would call the launching pad. And then we see the different colors on the screen. And these represent the different levels of body or self-identification. So the spirit was the portal, or the ÓLaoire, the thin place, the dimension shifter. And the individual rays are the souls fragmented inside this container. And each soul meets its own prism, its launching pad that's going to launch it into some form of incarnation. And then you have the colors displayed on the screen. And red represents our physical body, when we identify with our physiology. And orange represents the élan vital, the etheric body. And then the yellow represents the astral body, the place of emotions and dreams. And then the green represents our mental body, the place of the archetypes. And the blue represents our psychic abilities. But then when we get to indigo, it's about re-encountering and re-identifying with the soul self itself. And then violet is about re-encountering spirit, going back out through the portal and merging totally with source itself, with Godhead, or what Hinduism will call Parabrahma. So in that journey down, how do we go home? How do we find our way back? So altered states of consciousness are the portals through which souls explore different densities of apparent separation from source. And the ascension process is also fractal. And as I said, a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. And so this ascension process, it happens to individuals, it happens to entire cultures, it happens to each species, it happens to our planet, it happens to our solar system, it happens to our galaxy, it happens to our universe, and it happens to parallel universes. So this fractal of ascension is going on at all these different levels simultaneously. So this ascension process is also fractals through dimensional shifts. We're shifting dimensionals. And the portals are the thin places, are the doorways for this process. And when we talk about heaven or hell or purgatory, these are simply temporary stopovers on the journey to unitive consciousness. We've come from source. There was a ray of love to which we return, and from which nobody will ever be finally separated. There is no such thing as hell or purgatory, as permanent places. There are simply frequencies in which we live through our fear or our anger until we realize that only love is real and only God exists. Now, none of these stops are mandated by God, but they depend on the internal frequency of each soul. Birds of a feather flock together, and misery loves company. So we're naturally attracted to people who generate the same kind of frequency as ourselves. So the nearer if our frequency gets nearer and nearer to love, we get nearer and nearer to our home place. In Swahili, when I was preaching in Swahili, and people would ask me, what is heaven? And I would say, I created a phrase in Swahili that says, Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. And you can hear the alliteration even if you don't speak Swahili. Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. Which means heaven is not a place, It's a state of consciousness. So, my dear brothers and sisters, I invite you today, just wrestle with some of these questions for yourself. You know, are you dreaming? Is your life a dream? Is God's life a dream? Is it a lucid dream? And if so, can you return to your source self, your soul self, and God self? Namaste.